All right, broadcasting in 3, 2, 1.
Yeah, exactly. Very, very.
Good morning, everybody. Welcome to everybody, the early risers from Toronto. Welcome, good afternoon to all our friends in India. And welcome to everybody else from all places in the world that have joined us today for an exciting and most informative webinar with what I will call an exceptionally impressive and accomplished pair of panelists. I'm Theo Paridis. I'm professor of strategic management and international business at the Schulich School of Business. For the last 30 years, my work has taken me to many places around the world. And I have to admit, I have experienced firsthand the development and transformation of many countries, such as China and India, which is, of course, part of the focus of our discussion today. Our webinar is part of Schulich's series of Shaping the Post-Pandemic World and represents one of the school's many initiatives in response to the crisis. Over the last 4 months, the series, which originally was conceived by my good friend and colleague, Professor Ashwin Joshi, has brought together thought leaders and experts from our big Schulich family to the Schulich community. And we have asked them to share their insights, to share their perspectives, to share their points of view, and of course, make suggestions on what can we do and how we can help shape the post-pandemic world as a better, as a more inclusive, more engaged, a fair and more positive place for all of us. We were inspired by the success of this original series, and my good friend Ron Tubashu, one of the founding partners of Quest Partners and our associate in India, spearheaded a number of webinars that explicitly focused on India. Our series has benefited from our partnerships with the Indo-Canadian Business Chamber and Nadir Hamid, as well as the Canada-India Business Council and its CEO, Victor Thomas. As many of you know, in prior webinars, we addressed financial, technology, agri and food sector issues, as well as the challenges and opportunities facing the healthcare sector as it responds to the crisis. We also explore how responses to the crisis can benefit from a closer collaboration between Canada and India. Of course, we can't create all this good work without the tremendous supports of many people behind the scenes, and very critically, our one and only Vito Giovanetti, who is our own alumnus, who has been the technical brains behind all this effort, and who has set up everything so nicely so you don't notice him at all. But Vito has been the one sending the emails at 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning to you in making sure that everything works seamlessly and everything works very well, as you can see today. So let's get started. Let me go back to our good friends from Quest Partners, who are our country advisors, have been with us for the last 15 years, Ron Tubashu and Rimban Panju, who were instrumental in creating the series and of course, setting our seminar today. They both come from the financial sector, but they have been indispensable friends, partners, and advisors in our venture in India. So thank you both. They are here. We will be hearing from them, seeing them along the way. How have we structured today's session? We wanted to be a fireside chat. Of course, with temperatures that range from 30 to 45 degrees, fireside looks like a bit out of place. So let's call it a backyard chat. We have 2 exceptional panelists. We will give them a few minutes first to share their initial insights on how geopolitics are evolving and how the dynamics, political and economic dynamics, are changing very much in response to the pandemic that we still all face and we still the uncertainty in front of us. Those insights should get the conversation going, should help you and inspire your questions, your thoughts, your reactions. While these questions are coming in, I will ask my good friend Alan Middleton to put forth some questions to Naushad and get his insight from the vintage point of the industrialist for the vintage point of the global trotter, of the vintage point of somebody who has been working internationally, has traveled and educated himself internationally, and is very familiar with what's going on globally, but critically in Southeast Asia. So let me formally introduce our two panelists. First, Dr. Naushad Forbes, who is the co-chairman of Ford Marshalls. Ford Marshalls, for those people from Canada that don't know, is the leading steam engine and control instrumentation firm in India. It has world-class facilities that are constantly ranked among India's great places to work. Naushad is also the chairman of Ananda Aspen Center and Bharatiya Yuva Shakti Trust. And very importantly, the past president of the Confederation of Indian Industry, which is, like the word counts, the #1 entity that advocates into the government for the Indian industry as a whole. Also, Naushad is the chairman of the Center for Technology, Innovation, and Economic Research in Pune, where he is based. Naushad received his bachelor's, his master's, and his PhD degrees from Stanford in the US. And then for almost 20 years, he was also a lecturer and a consulting professor in issues of technology and in issues of industrializing countries. He also got a doctor's degree from the University of Edinburgh in Scotland, or for some people, the United Kingdom. Critically for us, Naushad is also on the board of several educational institutions and has a soft spot for education, for knowledge, for disseminating knowledge, and building strong education institutions in Canada. It also gives me a great pleasure to introduce my good friend, Alan Middleton, who is the executive director of the Schulich Executive Education Center. Alan was born, educated, and worked in the UK, as well as Norway, US, and Japan. For a number of years, I'm not gonna say the dates, Alan was the CEO of J. Walter Thompson in Japan, the third largest office globally for the big marketing and advertising firm that we're all familiar with. And is the company that does all the marketing for us big names like Ford and Kellogg and Mitsui. Alan, as it relates to our conversation today, has been visiting China every year, 2 and 3 times per year for the last 20 years. Alan opened our Executive Education Center's office in Beijing in 2003. That's 17 years ago. Alan developed our partnerships with the Guanghua School of Management in Peking University, which is the #1 school in China, as well as Bihan and Southwest Guotong University in Shanghai, in Chengdu. Alan has been all over India, has been working with many Chinese companies, and unquestionably has a vintage point to what China does and what China aspires to accomplish through its geopolitical moves. I should get out of the way. I should turn to Naushad and ask him to share his comments, because all of you are here to hear him and not me. Naushad.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Theo. Thank you for that very kind introduction. I'll start with just a very few comments. I thought I'd say a few things about India first, and then a couple of things, very few things about the world. Really a question more than anything else that's been playing in my head. I'll start with a little background in India, just so you know where I'm coming from. As you all know, India, as part of the global health crisis, I mean, the word that's used for our current health crisis is unprecedented. That's an overused word, but this is a time in history when it really applies. It's unprecedented in terms of the scale, in terms of the countries affected, in terms of the percentage of populations affected, and it's unprecedented also in terms of the economic response that that's resulted as governments have tried to respond to the spreading health crisis with various forms of lockdowns. Uh, Middle of April, when India was in its first lockdown, the estimate was that something like 60% of the world's population was under some form of lockdown or the other. So completely unprecedented relative to anything else that's ever happened before. The spread of the virus in India continues. We have a growing infection rate, a rate that is, I think at present, we're just at around 2 million cases with 40,000 deaths. We have at present the most rapidly rising numbers on some days in this last week or so of both cases, not yet deaths. But definitely something to be concerned about and something that is still unfolding as we speak. The Indian government responded very stringently to the health crisis very quickly as well, perhaps even too early towards the end of March, when we had put in place what by Oxford University has ranked the stringency of lockdowns around the world, and it ranked India at the top with a ranking of 100%. And that stringency of lockdown really halted economic activity very dramatically. In the course of 1 month, between roughly the middle of March and the middle of April, about 120 million people lost their jobs. That's a huge proportion. We ended up with an unemployment rate of around 27% middle of April. And then equally quickly, as the lockdowns unraveled over the next months, we saw that rate come down. By middle of May, the unemployment rate was down from 27 to about 21. By the middle of June, to around 12, 13%. And by the middle of July, the most recent numbers that we have say it's down to around 9%. Still high, still higher than in March, but a huge spike and then a decline. The estimates of GDP growth this year were that Q1 GDP growth probably dropped by around 30%. That would be the estimate I'd make on the basis of tax revenue. And most estimates for this year as a whole say that GDP will fall somewhere between 5 and 10%. Most estimates also say that there'll be a bounce back next year, but that still says that at best, come March 2022, so 2 years on almost, we will essentially be back in terms of economic activity to the level that we were at in March 2020. And it will be sort of two lost years of economic growth. So a very dramatic impact on the country, both from a health situation and from an economic situation. But I think it's always good, whenever you talk about India, one of the comments that I would always make is that India is a long-term bet. India is not a country that you bank on in the short run. The path is always going to be jagged, rocky, uneven, whatever word you wish to use, but the path points upwards. And it points upwards in a reasonably solid progression. And our long-term economic prospects, I think, are still robust. We've been, as a country, one of the world's 10 fastest growing economies over the last 30 years. We will continue to be one of the world's 10 fastest growing economies over the next 30 years. So in the long run, I think we will see these 2 years as an aberration, but we need to get over it as quickly as we can. We need to use the current crisis to fix things that need fixing. And we need to also ensure that some of our fundamentals that have been at the base of our success are sustained and are built on. and are not allowed to be diluted. Let me add, as I said, not more a question, but a comment leading to a question on the world, and then I'll turn things over to Alan. You know, one of the things that's been striking to me as a citizen, looking at the whole COVID crisis unfold around the world, has been the complete absence of world leadership. We've seen good leadership in individual countries, but we've seen no coordinated effort to actually bring countries together and try and say, how should we as a world respond to what at the end of the day is a global crisis? And if it's a global crisis, there should be a global response. There hasn't been. The reason is very clear. The reason is that the country that we usually look to play that lead role in world leadership, which is the US, has gone missing. And it's gone missing because of the current incumbent of the White House. And based on the current incumbent of the White House, you know, the whole America First policy, etc., and the way in which
Imran is coming on this webinar. Imran.
The way that the response is also their own response in the US's own response to the COVID crisis, I think has just meant that there's been this missing piece in how the world runs. And so the question that I guess I have in my head is, how can we make the world less of a hostage to being lucky enough to have someone sensible in the White House? You know, we hope that Joe Biden will win the election in November, and we will have some good sense return to the White House. But can we as a world continue to remain hostage to that kind of chance? That shouldn't we, is there something that like-minded countries can do coming together to make the world more immune to leadership issues in any one country? You know, is it possible for countries that broadly believe in a rules-based international system, in democratic participation and democratically participative institutions, in multilateral institutions and multilateralism, is it possible for like-minded countries to come together? And what would that take? Now, this is not a new idea and not a unique idea. Many people have spoken about it and have spoken about it for a while. But if, for example, you say that a Canada with a GDP of what, $1.5 trillion, and India with a GDP of say $2.8, $2.9 trillion, at least last year, and Australia with a GDP of 1.2 trillion, Japan with a GDP of what, 5 trillion, Germany with 4 trillion. You know, is it possible, an Indonesia with a little over 1 trillion, you know, is it, South Korea with also about 1 trillion, is it possible to, maybe, is it possible for us to come together as sort of like-minded countries that believe in a rules-based international order? And what would that mean? What form would that take? Does it mean a new institution? What does it mean in terms of contributions and support for multilateral institutions? What does it mean for writing checks to multilateral institutions so that we strengthen them and our own participation and leadership of them? What does it mean ultimately for how we collaborate one with the other to provide some alternative to world leadership? Because I mean, the kind of crisis we've seen it needs better than whether it's the health response in countries or getting access to vaccines or anything else. I will stop there and turn things over to Alan.
Okay, and Theo?
Yes,
All right.
absolutely, Alan.
So thank you, everybody. I feel a bit like clearing up after the magnificent procession has gone past, because I'd like to find some areas I can disagree with Naushad, but from what he said, I can't, because I heartily agree with everything. So I'm going to group my initial remarks into, if you like, 3 or 4 areas. One, I want to talk global from the point of view of the US's closest neighbor, along with Mexico. Second, want to talk a little bit about my views on China. And then thirdly, on to India and India-Canada relations, though recognize Naushad's the expert on that. Globally, let me say instantly, I share Naushad's dream. If you take the 1940s and beyond, there was this period with the setup of the United Nations, with international banking regulations, with a number of things happening, and most importantly, independence from the old colonial powers, that it looked like the world actually wanted to compare notes and share stuff. And then, of course, the development of the European Union as it developed, and which a lot of people underestimate its power. That was a continent that had been consistently at war for over 1,000 years, actually managed to come together with some kind of a shared agreements. So what's happened? What's gone on? And Naushad's dead right. We've got a lack of global leadership, and because of cowardice at that leadership, a retreat into separation and country first, and most evidently by Canada's closest partner, the United States. So what we seem to have developing there, but not just there, but also certain countries in Europe like Hungary and Poland and a number of other places, a back to separation rather than togetherness orientation. We seem to be having people who emphasize difference rather than similarity. And that's the big challenge of the world. So a question I'm going to pick up with Naushad a bit later on is I agree with his thought that there needs to be new alliances. He mentioned some of the countries that share tremendous economic capability and potential, but need to get together in a new way. I'm hoping the EU will stay together and step up to be part of that. Sad that we're losing one of the great leaders in Europe, Angela Merkel from Germany, stepping down next year. But that's hopeful. Perhaps the use of COVID to link it to Naushad's starting point is one of the things that is working cooperatively is the healthcare system. We've been doing interviews ourselves with a number of healthcare leaders, domestically, globally, drug companies, heads of hospitals. And other than the US, with its total failure during the COVID crisis because of its over-commercialized healthcare system, there's a lot of cooperation going on the pandemic. Now, whether that will remain over time is a big issue, but at least you've got the theme that those countries listening to their medical advisors seem to be being prepared to swap information and turn things around. So unfortunately, my net summary on the global orientation, though, is big battle to overcome this increasing selfishness and separation evidenced by global leadership in so many countries. China. Just some stats on China. Everybody knows it's the second biggest economy. Important for the commercial sector. In the Fortune Global 500 corporations, China now has more of its organizations in the Global 500 biggest than the United States. So you've got huge organizations from China, some state-owned, some private, but they've aggressively moved out globally, not just through Belt and Road, which is not like, for those of you old enough, the old US Marshall Plan. It's not been all gifts. A lot of it is loans, and a lot of it has capability to sort of pull in the reins. But there was no doubt that for a long time, China looked like it was going to use its soft power at exactly the point in time the United States was, under its current leadership, almost withdrawing. Unfortunately, the Xi Jinping administration has proved itself to be as aggressively centralizing and controlling, almost back to the Mao Zedong roots. So China watchers like ourselves, who had hoped for an opening of the economy following Deng Xiaoping's brilliance and insight into how to develop the economy, doesn't seem to be doing that well. Just ask people in Hong Kong, and just ask a few Canadians imprisoned because of disagreements with the Huawei senior executive being held in Vancouver on a US request. So where is China in the future? And this is the big challenge for India, because we have the US as our next door neighbor. We have to put up with that. You have China as your northern neighbor, with already disputes on the border. China has been very successful in its tech industries, in its rail industry. So you're now dealing with the countries with one of the highest mileage of high-speed rail, over 100,000 kilometers almost completed in rapid rail transit, which is binding the country together. Plus its work in telecommunications and Huawei and some of the others. So it has invested successfully in some superb state-owned enterprises. But also it had a revolution from its non-state-owned enterprises. And there are two standouts there, Alibaba and Tencent, both of which have gone around the world most successfully. There's a challenge for India. I'll come back to India in a second. The challenge to India on the global list, India only has 7 to 10 corporations, substantial and doing a lot of business outside of India. Obviously, Tata most successfully in that, Reliance and some other very well-known names. But one of the challenges for India and its global positioning is the opportunity for its enterprises to be seen as a good option if it can get its technology out there and if it can get its capability out there. And that's obviously one of the things in the Canada-India relationship that we need to work on further and get better developed. So is China a threat? The answer is yes. Is it a military threat? I don't have the experience or the depth of knowledge to comment on that, but it is absolutely a soft power threat, and depending on how it continues its current policy, might even be a growing threat of international trade, although the opportunity was there for them to not replace the US, but substantially take over the US during this period of terrible leadership. So let's move on to India and Canada. Has India got huge opportunities? The answer is absolutely yes. It's, as you already know, as mentioned, a top economy, performing well, not backed by COVID, as is everybody. But the opportunity must come, and I'll fess up to a bias. I'm a global, open, reduced tariffs man. Tariffs need to protect industries getting set up in the early days, but there is no doubt the global economy benefits from as much transition of trade around the world, not just to low-cost labor markets, but to achieve ideas and collaboration as much as possible, much in the way of the healthcare sector I was talking earlier. With China heading in its current political direction, even if Joe Biden wins in the States, I think, unfortunately, the Trump administration has harmed a lot of people's belief in debate, rule of law, and democracy. So that as a standout model needs to be replaced by others. Maybe that coalition I talked about of the willing countries. Maybe we should bring in the Prime Minister from New Zealand, who seems to have done everything right so far. But there's that opportunity. But for India particularly, with Canada's help, because you know the amount of relations between those two countries and its peoples is very high, but it needs to get more developed. We will be working to pressure the Canadian government for more trade relationships. But the important challenge to India, and I'm going to finish on this point, back to our main speaker, the divisions that affect so many other parts of the world, and we're seeing in Black Lives Matter and various issues in the States and other places, must be addressed in India on some of its religious and some of its political divides. So it too needs leadership, both on the commercial end and the political end, that recognize the advantages of differences and viewpoints and the opportunities of pulling those together on a global basis. So those would be my intro remarks, Theo, before we move on to questions. anything that you want to pick up as the moderator before we go to a Q&A session?
One of the things that there are three words that come in through the comments and the questions that I think both of you should remember, that seem to be the interest of the panel of our audience. The one is the lack of leadership, and let's leave out politics and which are political leanings, but the attendees are questioning not just that they recognize this lack of leadership, and they were asking to see, do you see any hope? Why is it in all previous crises there were great leaders that emerged, and we don't see anything right now? So lack of leadership is one thing. The second thing, of course, is the cooperation, collaboration at multiple levels. Whether we're talking about the Canada-India and areas where we can cooperate and benefit from each other's friendly relationship, and the links that we have over the years, especially with the Indian diaspora in our country. But also there are people that are talking about collaboration globally to respond to the crisis, whether it is in development of vaccines or new cross-country systems. And where are the areas where collaboration will be beneficial and is mostly needed? The last issue that has come up is human rights violations. And there is that we see a number of governments that are actually taking advantage of the pandemic to further their suppression agendas, and whether either of you would like an opportunity to comment on it.
Now, I'd like to ask a question picking off on your first one, Theo, which is India's corporation sector and business sector, and its orientation within India or externally as an opportunity. Other than the two or three companies that I've mentioned, do you think there's interest in the corporate sector in India in really building those global linkages?
So I think it's a very good question. Actually, I think all these issues are very substantive, important issues for us to address in sequence. But I think the question on Indian companies is very important. I think we have to remember that until 1991, we were such a closed economy that companies did not know how to effectively operate overseas. There were a few exceptions, like the Aditya Birla Group that established a strong presence in Southeast Asia and so on. And there were obviously people of Indian origin who were very successful in Eastern Africa, in places as far afield as Fiji and so on. But by and large, Indian industry was inward looking. It was used to operating in a protected market. It was used to operating, I think, without necessarily, I think we did not make the best products, and we didn't make them as efficiently as was available elsewhere. And that first had to change. And that did change over a few decades. I think today, the quality of products and the price levels and so on, and the efficiency in the country is pretty globally competitive. But too much of Indian industry, exactly as you say, is still too inward looking. The Tatas are indeed an honorable exception. Well over half their revenue, I think 60% of their revenue.
And TCS is such a success globally.
TCS is a huge success. I mean, it accounts for over 2/3 of Tata's profits, from their 100 and some companies. So there are a few exceptions, but they're too few. My own sense is that the future of India will, and its presence its industrial presence overseas, will come from two sources. First, it will come from a wide participation of Indian industry as opposed to 20 or 30 giant firms. So we will have the Tatas, and if Reliance decided that it was interested in the world and not only in India, then maybe even Reliance
Yep.
certainly has the resources. But as of so far, it's been largely India focused.
Yeah.
I think our future actually rests on having hundreds, if not maybe even a few thousand good, successful Indian firms that are in the, let's say, $100 million to $2 billion range, operating internationally and establishing a strong presence. So in a sense, I think the future of Indian industry, a good future of Indian industry should look more like Germany. It should look more like the Mittelstand, businesses of Germany.
Which is about 40% of the German economy is in that Mittelstand group.
Such a powerhouse.
Yeah.
And for that to happen, first, Indian firms need to have international ambition. They need to see their market as being promising and more promising outside of India. And second, we need to invest a lot more in technology and innovation. Total in-house R&D by Indian industry is about 0.3, 0.4%, maybe 0.4% now of GDP.
Yeah.
The world average is 1.5%.
Yeah.
The Chinese average is 1.5%.
Yeah.
Right? So we need to scale our investment in technology within our firms by a factor of 5. And if we can do those two things together, of substantially increasing our investments in technology within our firms and substantially increasing our investments in developing markets overseas and our presence overseas as firms, and do it on a widespread basis, hundreds and hundreds of firms, I think that's the way we will see the emergence of a strong Indian industrial presence overseas. I think it will happen that way, and indeed I hope it will happen that way, rather than through a few champion firms, because a few champion firms, well, it works. A few champion firms tend to go better with more authoritarian regimes. They tend
like
to
South Korea
China.
went out.
South Korea earlier on,
yeah.
Right? I mean, and they still struggle with the legacy of having these really strong, influential, politically connected chaebol. So it's I think the future of India rests in that direction.
I think that's an absolutely wonderful model. Is that a model you think that politically would be acceptable in the Indian context?
So I think politically it's very acceptable.
Yeah.
For years, certainly under Indira Gandhi, there was a suspicion of bigness in firms. If a firm became big, it was probably doing something wrong. Was this general sort of mindset, we had absurd rules for many years where actually we were probably the only country in the world that had maximum capacity limits that were established by the government, where they gave you a licensed capacity. You had a licensed capacity, and if you exceeded it, you were punished. So if you got really efficient and debottlenecked and so on and exceeded the capacity, then you were in trouble.
Yeah.
So it was very, all that's fortunately in the past. But I want to come back to a point that you made, Alan, about tariffs. Between 1991 and 2017, the move in India was consistently reduced tariffs.
Yep.
Since 2017, that has reversed.
Yes.
And we've had many rounds of tariff increases. Very popular, as tariffs usually are with industry. They shouldn't be. Because if industry is actually interested in its own medium and long-term prospects, as opposed to its immediate short-term prospects, they would recognize that tariffs are bad. It permits inefficiency and permits one to operate in a protected home market instead of being forced to compete with foreign firms at home. And if you can compete with foreign firms at home, that's the first step to competing with them overseas.
Absolutely.
So I think, we've seen this reversal in recent years, which is troubling. And I think it's one that we will have to re-reverse to get back on track with being much more internationally competitive and much more outward looking as an entire industrial sector.
Yeah, it's a dilemma that Canada's always faced, and I agree with you, because too often for too many years Canada had huge protection. The trouble is, when it went down, there was also takeovers of Canadian industry by American organizations primarily, but also European. How do you see this plea, I call it that, which I totally agree with, for greater cooperation emerging post-COVID? And just a little background to that question. What's happened with our leaders in Canada in some of the conversations we've been having with leaders? Everybody's recognizing that the old systems were too siloed, that hospitals weren't closely enough working with drug companies, weren't working closely enough with Ministry of Health, and hospital leadership, while fabulous, wasn't being learned in building cultures across to the private sector. So you had a series of post-industrial revolution siloed attitudes to industries, and indeed within industry. What we're hearing from leaders, and I hope it does continue in Canada, is getting close to the frontline workers more and listening to them, flattening hierarchies, and trying to get rid of some of the bureaucracy that inhabits government, not-for-profits, private sector, that's unnecessarily. How do you see the hope for that in Indian organizations?
So we've certainly seen in our response to the health crisis, we've seen some of those barriers break down. So, for example, our regulatory system to get approvals to test drugs, the most obvious being, COVID treatments and then vaccines, have been hugely speeded up. Relative, I mean, it's taking days where it used to take years. I mean, literally, in terms of getting through some of those regulations and regulatory processes. If you look at the occasional bouts of collaboration that we've seen in dealing with the health crisis between the center and states, where healthcare is a state subject in India. We have a federal system like Canada, and so healthcare is a state subject in India. The central government, the union government, has a limited role to play, but it has a very valuable role that it should play in actually establishing best practice, in spreading the influence of science and data, and in setting a set of metrics that really say what's working and where. We've not done that adequately. We could play a much stronger role, I think, from the union government in providing that set of standardized metrics and that use of science and data as a base for measuring effective responses by states and local governments. States in India, I mean, it's a little like the US in that sense. I mean, states have varied hugely in their response and their effectiveness. We've had some extraordinary examples of success. The state of Kerala was an early success, very much like the country of Vietnam and Sri Lanka. But in the same way, we've seen in Bombay itself, in Dharavi, in the slum of Dharavi, which has 1 million people living in a 2 square kilometer area. That Dharavi is now being written up correctly as a very successful story of controlling the spread of the virus in unimaginably challenging conditions, where people live 6 and 10 to a room, and 60 and 80 people share a toilet. So I mean, the worst possible circumstances to control the spread of a virus like this, and it's been controlled. So we have these stories that are, I think, great success stories, and the union government should be picking them up and making sure that they are fully understood, that there are the right set of metrics in place, and that more and more states are being encouraged to deploy them in their own way and area.
Absolutely. Because a lot of the audience is people going through various forms of education or having been through various forms of education, I want to pick up on a chapter question, which is, in this new world for the future, how do you see the role of education systems? And give you a chance to think. There are three parts to that question. One of which is obviously how much can be done online rather than in person because of COVID. For instance, our university absolutely is not going back to classrooms, at least in the fall, and who knows, it may be longer. So we're having to learn to do better online. But secondly, where do we target, where do we encourage people to go? We're obviously recognizing their base skills. But for instance, in surveys we've done in North America, analytics comes up as a #1 capability for management education. Project management comes up in a whole bunch of different areas. So there are certain themes coming up. And then the third is something you talked about, but I'll call a word humanity, or building a positive culture in an organization to go across the silos. So how do you think the education system should respond in those three ways, and any others you want to build in?
Good question. So I'm trying to think a little on the fly. I think the responsibility of education is not, in a sense, to be immediately relevant. I think most educationists would agree this.
Yeah.
So the good education is not meant to teach people skills that they can immediately go out and apply in the workplace. That's fine if you have a skilling program, but not if you have a good educational program. It's instead meant to teach you, it's meant to give you enough foundational understanding so that you can then learn the skills and capabilities that you need to learn that adapt to your particular circumstances at that point in time. Having said that, I do think that your last point on sort of culture and on humanism is very important, and it's one that we struggle with in India. For too long, we've had an education system that has been very narrow and professionally focused. That we produce, as you know, a huge number of engineers a year, 3 billion engineers or something a year. And of the engineers that we produce, they tend to take no courses in the social sciences and humanities. It's a very bad thing. And then these engineers go on and get MBAs, and again take no courses in the humanities and social sciences. And so you come out with a somewhat twisted education, if you ask me. And to then turn around and sort of say that one should have some feeling for what society really needs and what a good society looks like when you've not actually been exposed to anything that gives you the right background is, I think, a challenge. So I think addressing, providing a wider liberal education, even in a remedial way, is probably a good idea. And if we look at what's driven whether the success of Donald Trump in getting elected or Brexit, it's coming from, I think, to some extent, it's a failure of our education system as well, in that it's not delivering the kind of citizens that it should.
Interesting.
So now how do you go about fixing that? I think there's this big space and need for a broader liberal education and understanding of history, and understanding of debate, and understanding of how theories of history get overturned, and so on. But I think there's also then a need for those tools that you mentioned that we need, analytical tools, communication tools, tools of collaboration. How do you work effectively together? These are all very important. one last comment on, well,
Mm.
actually two last comments if I can on, one on primary education. I think we should worry very much about the impact that, that the current lockdowns are having on, it's easy for people who are more affluent, who can give their kids
Yes.
tablets and so on. But for poorer people, we've been involved in some projects from our company, CSR work in villages near Pune. And I mean, these are children who are 7, 8 years old, who are today taking their classes, borrowing their parents' relatively old, rather, not a very good quality smartphone, and that's their connect with education today. And it's, I mean, how long is this going to continue? Otherwise, and people and children, I think, are getting into the habit of not going to school.
Yep.
And that's very dangerous. So I think I really worry about what the current crisis is doing to poorer kids in poorer countries.
Yeah.
I think that it's a big challenge. And then the other, particularly with regard to management, management schools and companies, is, working from home is fine, but how do you build a culture, a company culture that's effective working from home? I don't know.
Absolutely.
But I think Schulich should figure that out.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because I think it's a big challenge. It's I mean, we think in our company we have a good culture. We're working from that just now as we all work from home. But we've hired a couple of 2 new managers who joined us while we've been working from home. And I have a real concern about how well they're being integrated, and are they learning what the culture is about, and what the company is all about, and how you are successful there, and so on. Because, I mean, I don't know how well we're doing with integrating them when we're in a non-physical setting.
Yeah. It is absolutely tough. We've got some research evidence coming out of North America that people who've worked together before are finding it easier to work on distance. And I'm sure that would be replicated around the world, because you've already got that sense of sharing and personality, and getting to see the dogs and the cats and the kids walk across the screen from home is actually adding to that.
You can probably hear my dogs.
Yes, absolutely. But it is difficult for onboarding, for getting people on board to, if you like, get that culture, because they're so torn back at the home office, and people are just faces on screen. So absolutely. Are you an optimist? I'll give you a chance to think about that question. For India in this, assuming COVID's with us as an effect for, I totally agree with what you're talking about, for at least the next year, and probably impacting into 2022. But there is no doubt that the old, let me call it the old global powers, Russia and the United States being the 2 most recent, and now the emergence of China, may be influencing the world less because of the growth of other groups, India being one, hopefully the European Union staying together with another, some of the other Southeast Asian economies. So that sharing that's needed in this new world is a big challenge. So how optimistic are you that we do have the leadership hiding to be able to do it?
So I'm optimistic that we will in individual countries throw up surprisingly good leaders. Sometimes in ways that even surprise their own countries, and certainly in ways that surprise the world. I mean, you mentioned New Zealand, right? I imagine that people in New Zealand were not surprised by how wonderful a leader Jacinda Ardern has turned out to be. But the world certainly, the world was not used to thinking about New Zealand. I mean,
Yeah.
there's this great Oscar Wilde quote, right? That there's this world, and then there's the next, and then there's New Zealand.
That's right.
And it's so we weren't used to thinking about New Zealand, but suddenly you've got this great model of leadership there.
Yep.
And then you mentioned Angela Merkel. I mean, maybe after she retires from sort of running Germany next year, she should run our group of our collaborative effort around sort of 10 like-minded countries. But that needs to then come from. I'm less optimistic about the global leadership bit. I'm more confident about the individual country leadership being of high quality. And the reason I'm less confident about the global leadership is that, I don't know, maybe, it probably took the Second World War to bring countries together and have them put a wider human interest ahead of their own even national interest. I mean, I'm definitely not advocating anything like that, but I'm saying in the absence of a global war, the absence of I mean, can we turn the COVID crisis into that global challenge for that leadership to come to the fore? It would be fabulous. I mean, it would make the whole thing even possibly worthwhile.
Absolutely. That's a lovely thought. I'm going to bung in one last question, and then to alert Theo, I'm going to go back to Theo for any chat questions he's picked up or anything else. And this is a little unfair, but I'm so impassioned by your answers to things. One of the issues we've got about separateness is the role of media, both formal and informal media. And unfortunately, we have a president down south of Canada, in the US, who uses it to divide. I mean, the whole Twitter operation and the credibility issue of where do you go for facts? One of the things I think that marks the strength of those countries that have responded well is they've listened to their medical experts with data rather than supposition, even though the antivirus movement is growing again in the States. How do we manage the media? How do people in the street get any kind of credible information that they can rely on or build in their judgment? Or do the whole education system have to tell people, don't trust anything you hear unless you've got at least 5 different sources? Question for your viewpoint on that.
So without question, I mean, this is the challenge is that with social media, I mean, it's this well-known thing that everyone talks about, that social media tends to divide more than it unifies, because you tend to be on all those groups and subscribe to just those things that cater to your own opinion. And that support your own opinion. And so, your own biases get stronger over time, and you get less and less exposure to alternative viewpoints and viewpoints that you do not want to hear and that you do not agree with.
Absolutely.
So the whole role of a newspaper that would be the newspaper of a city, or even of a country, where there's some attempt to have a divergence of views, and this is something that I think all sides of opinion don't come off well with. It's they all seem to really channel thinking. So how do we address that? There is this underlying assumption that social media self-corrects. That Wikipedia, if you put the wrong facts up there, someone will get on there and correct the facts. So you have some sources like Wikipedia that I think are impressive, and they may not get everything right, but they try to, and they self-correct, and they have a mechanism for self-correction. And how do we make the Wikipedia model a more a bigger part of our media input? We have in India, we have 2 very good sources that were started by, actually, he was a television journalist named Govindraj Ethiraj. And Govind started 2 two media outfits, one called Boom, that just checks facts. So you can send something that you want checked out
Okay.
to Boom, and they'll check it out for you, and then they circulate to everyone what the truth was. So if fake news is put out there, they will address it and put it out to everyone. And they're completely non-ideological. They will check anyone's facts. Second, he started something called India Spin, where they actually do the same kind of thing, where they put things out that are well dated, good facts, well checked out, etc. So maybe we'll see more of these kinds of outfits getting started as a response to the problem that you mentioned, and that as people start building off those data, maybe we'll end up in a better place with more accurate information. I think one other thing that I'd say, and then I'll stop, is that maybe the current crisis is also teaching people a lesson. In that, I mean, it should be very encouraging to us that Trump has lost popularity. With the way in which he's responded to the crisis, and I think if that results in people then wanting more data that is more solid, that would be very healthy. I worry a bit about how the whole Black Lives Matter crisis is unfolding, and how it's also taken this turn of being somewhat being not very receptive to alternative views. Even if the views are wrong, we have to be receptive to them and let them be heard. So I mean, I don't know how it's going to come out in the end, but it's I think my only source of confidence is that as it becomes cheaper and cheaper for media outfits to operate, maybe we'll have more and more voices, and but will we have those voices that will also be coherent and pull things together substantially enough? It'll come back to education. It'll come back to, if we do the right job with educating people, they will try to seek out better sources of data.
Excellent, thank you. I'm going to hand back to Theo for some closing, and then I think he's going to come to you for closing remarks.
Actually, at the risk of offending the people that have something else to do and they were marking that we're finished in time, I'm going through all the comments and the questions, and there are underlying things that go back to not just the great points you made about leadership, about countries, about political systems, but there's also very much what businesses can be doing facing the challenges they face, both of the pandemic and the new political forces. And because we talked a lot about the Indian industry and its failings and the promise for the future, and it is inward versus outward exploitation, there are also questions about small, medium enterprises and what could they be doing. And of course, my bias here is globalization for small, medium enterprises in response to the crisis they face, or taking opportunities or being hampered by the crisis. I'll ask you that, and also if there are some parting comments that you want to make to summarize the discussion. Should I go first to Darshad and then to Alan?
So on the role of small and medium enterprises, in India we have we should first talk about what we mean by small and medium. So we recently changed the definition of small and medium enterprises in India. We greatly expanded the limits, the definition limits of a small enterprise and a medium enterprise. And it was long overdue. We really needed to do it. It's a very good thing that this is being done. But a medium enterprise in India is now, I think, a company with a turnover of, let me try and do it in US dollars, 35 million US dollars. So it's a fairly small enterprise for a medium-sized company. And we probably need to be looking at a much higher limit if we talk about medium-sized companies. We should, I think, be looking at, say, 100 million, that 100 million to 200, 2 billion range, as a medium to medium large. We should be looking at small enterprises as being, in the sub 100 million range in a way. And if we think about it in those terms, then they have every ability to, I think, they're very challenged because of a lack of resources in the present times with the economic lockdowns and crisis. But those that come through it, and they need help in coming through it with loan guarantees and so on, which have now been provided, those that come through it will, I think, thrive as they always have, by providing a particular niche of product or service that is better done by them than anyone else, including large firms, where they can simply outcompete on service relative to larger companies in the same area, even if it's more geographically focused. So I think a range of areas where small and medium enterprises have always found their sources of competitiveness. In terms of parting comments, I don't know if I have any parting comments of value to offer beyond. I will come to one of the points that you mentioned, Alan, which is you talked about diversity and you talked about divisiveness and so on, and I hope that in India that we see the emergence of leadership, and there was a comment that said, look, lack of leadership, and after that there was the phrase, leave out politics. Well, I don't think you can. I mean, I think if you talk about leadership, you have to include politics, and certainly in a country you have to, and I hope for a political leadership in the country that sees its future and sees its success as being a more unifying politics that tries to focus on what makes us similar and what our common interests are, and focuses much less on what divides us, whether the divisiveness is based on religion or anything else. So I hope for that. I worry about it a lot because I think that as a country in India, we're an incredibly diverse country. I would argue the most diverse country that exists in terms of the number of languages, communities, percentages, all of that. And the only way that India can succeed is if we use our diversity as a strength and have a minimum agenda of unifying elements. And then rely really on the enterprise of people and states and communities and companies to really make things happen, as opposed to one or two wise leaders.
Excellent. My final thoughts, and I'm going to pick up on that one last because I totally agree. And it's that magical word innovation. And innovation is aided so much by listening to alternative ways to do things, and listening to people with backgrounds that are different and say, well, why do you need to do that? And, have you tried this? Backgrounds in different experiences and training. So the very diversity issue is key to innovation, which links to my comment about small, medium enterprise. And as you said, I loved your vision that, India's opportunity may be, the Mittelstand of Asia Pacific. And I think that's absolutely brilliant. But what it needs is to recognize that innovation is going to lead that speed of response to the marketplace is something smaller companies can always utilize relative to bigger organizations, that providing you protect your capability, working with bigger organizations can often give you the start, because a lot of small, medium sectors start up that way. But also with the examination of opportunities outside your immediate area. because I think, you know, an investigation of what Indian technology capability is capable of applies in so many places. I'll use a Canadian industry as an example. Canada has one of the leaders in technology for ozone sniffing, sending up balloons to sniff ozone in the area. Now, there are only about 100 customers globally, but this tiny little Canadian company, it's not so tiny, services about 80 of them. And it's those opportunities where in the tech area, in the innovation area, where it goes. But the other thing I'd also add in for small, medium enterprise is network, and network, because they share size and problems that they can learn from, obviously, educational institutions, obviously watching what big companies do, but from each other. And if you're solid on what you're doing is a point of difference, and you can move faster, and you can keep improving, and yes, get the funds, then that opportunity is there, and that would be my view. So overall, I'll ask the question I asked myself, am I an optimist? I'm an optimist for India. I'm an optimist for Canada. I'm not sure I'm going to see in the next 2 or 3 years the move to the integration of effort post-COVID that I'd really like. But I think if we start watching and listening to the healthcare organizations as they begin to work globally, hopefully we can push that on to a whole bunch of other organizations. And if any politicians are listening, I really like the idea of New Zealand, Australia, India, Canada, Turkey, and a bunch of other places getting together and ignoring the traditional big organizations and say, okay, let's us actually get together. So Theo, back to you.
Thank you very much, Alan. Thank you very much, Naushad. Great conversation. You cover a range of topics, staying within the theme and staying within the very exciting, interesting, and provocative questions we got from our attendees. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. I have already promised our attendees that we will get back to them with some further insights from the questions we didn't cover. But let me one more time thank Dr. Naushad Forbes and Dr. Alan Middleton for creating a beautiful webinar. And thank you all from around the world for attending and making it rich as it was. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks.
Theo, you're going to stay on?
Yes, ladies and gentlemen, we'll see if the
Naushad?
numbers.
Yes, hi, I'm on.
Naushad, what